All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist in my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And today I have a very special guest, one who I'm very excited to speak with, and we are going to discuss Friedrich Schlegel, Novalis, and the Athenaeum Journal. And today I've invited Dr. Nathan Brown, who is a professor of English at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, where he's also Canada Research Chair in Poetics and Director of the Center for Expanded Poetics. His research moves between literature, philosophy, and the arts, with a particular focus on comparative approaches to modern poetry and poetics. Dr. Brown's current book project is titled Irony of Ground: Studies in the Romantic Poetics of Modernity, setting out from the suturing of philosophy to literature by the Jena Romantics. The chapters work through case studies in poetry, music, architecture, and painting to situate the enduring importance of Romanticism as the interrogation of contradictions, attended upon the positing of subjective, epistemological, artistic, and political foundations. He is the author of Rationalist Empiricism, a theory of speculative critique in 2021, and The Limits of Fabrication, Materials, Science, and Materialist Poetics, 2017, as well as a study of Baudelaire titled Baudelaire's Shadow, an Essay on Poetics, Determination in 2021. Dr. Brown's complete translation of Baudelaire and the Flowers of Evil are forthcoming from Verso on November 26, 2024. So, Dr. Brown, thank you so much for being a part of this series and for being here today with us.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate the invitation.
No, it's quite the honor, actually. I've been looking forward to speak about the Jena Romantics or any element of the Romantics for quite a long time. So perhaps we could begin with who were Friedrich Schlegel and Novalis and what makes their body of work important for today.
Okay. Well, I think the first thing that we can say is that these are very different people. Um, they're associated from a relatively young age, and they end up having quite a great deal in common. But they come from different backgrounds and they have very different interests. I think the first thing to say about them that's important in a show like this, which is dedicated to philosophy, um, is that they have a sort of tangential relationship to philosophy. Both of these figures are heavily influenced by Kant and Fichte. Both of them are situated in the sequence, let's say, between Fichte and Hegel, in many ways also working alongside Schelling. But neither of them are exactly philosophers, although they do some philosophical writing and teaching. So let me just back up and say a little bit about their background and how they come to be known as members of the circle called the Jena Romantics, what we now know as the Jena Circle. And then I can say a little bit about their publications and their discrepant interests and why they're important today. So Friedrich Schlegel is born in 1772. He dies in 1829. And he's born into, let's say, kind of upper middle class, culturally prominent family in Hanover. So his father is a clergyman and a writer. His brother, of course, is A.W. Schlegel, who becomes a very important scholar and translator and art historian. Um, and we can say that Friedrich Schlegel is first and foremost a classicist and a literary critic. He's a scholar, he's a philologist. He's educated at the University of Göttingen and Leipzig, and he studies law and classical literature. And importantly, his first book is titled On the Study of Greek Poetry, which he writes in 1795. So he begins as a scholar of Greek literature. And he's thinking in that book about the relationship between modern and ancient literature. And he's thinking about the problem of what the philosophers and the writers of his time would have called Bildung, right? So cultivation or formation. Um, a way of thinking about the study of Greek poetry as a process of Bildung and why that's important in modernity. One might situate that kind of work, especially in 1795, alongside Schiller's Letters on Aesthetic Education, and also alongside Schiller's, of course, important essay on naive and sentimental poetry, which is also about the relationship between ancient and modern literature, and the project, let's say, of Bildung or aesthetic education. Um, Schlegel then becomes quite an interesting figure insofar as, on the one hand, he's a classicist obsessed with ancient Greek literature, a reader of Schiller, a contemporary of Schiller, a contributor to Schiller's journal, Die Horen. But he also then breaks, let's say, with classicism, and this is what we might call kind of the birth of Romanticism. It's very important to Schlegel to find new forms, new modes of thought, and particularly new forms and modes of thought that we might say take place between the disciplines, so between literature and philosophy in particular for him. Um, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the Jena Circle and the journal The Athenaeum. Uh, but Schlegel will then go on to be the editor of the Athenaeum. So from 1798 to 1800, one of the most important journals of, let's say, the 1790s, of the sequence of German idealism and German Romanticism. Um, for that, he'll publish many things in that journal, which becomes the sort of organ of his group in Jena. He'll publish the Athenaeum fragments along with some of his collaborators. He'll publish a text called On Philosophy to Dorothea, which is written to his partner Dorothea Schlegel. I'm sorry. In 1799, he'll also publish a very interesting, I would say, experimental novel titled Lucinda. And then he'll famously publish his dialogue on poetry in 1800, which is a very important text. Then in 1801, Schlegel and Dorothea Schlegel, well, she'll become Dorothea Schlegel, will move to Berlin. They'll finally get married. Then he'll move on to Paris, then to Cologne. And the group that he's associated with in the 1790s sort of breaks up. Schlegel will, do some interesting things. He'll convert to Catholicism. He'll study Sanskrit and Hindu religious texts. He'll publish a book titled On the Language and the Wisdom of the Indians, on Indian philosophy and language. And then he'll eventually accept a civil service position in Vienna. And famously, Schlegel then becomes a kind of conservative figure, really peeling off from, in many ways, his radicalism and his support for the French Revolution in the 1790s. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to Friedrich Schlegel. On the other hand, Friedrich von Hardenberg, who will become known by his pen name Novalis, is born into a noble family in Thuringia. And Novalis, his father is the director of mines. So his father is a natural scientist and an engineer. And Novalis will become many things, a philosopher, a poet, and a natural scientist who's trained in fields like chemistry and geology. He studies biology. He studies engineering at the same time as he's studying Kant and Fichte. Um, he'll study law and history in Jena, actually. So he's the first of this group in some ways to arrive in Jena, 1790 to 1791. He's studying law and history in Jena with Reinhold, in fact, also. Um, and so Schiller, right? Schiller is in Jena from 1789 to 1799. And along with Fichte is one of the major, let's say, intellectual attractions in Jena. Schiller and Fichte are the kind of the soul of Jena. But Novalis is there for a while in the early 1790s, and then he'll continue his studies in Leipzig, where he meets Schlegel. And let me just read this very interesting passage from a letter from Friedrich Schlegel to his brother August when he meets Novalis. I think this is a really helpful passage for getting the sort of texture of this relationship and maybe what Novalis meant to some of these people, how he struck them and what he was like. Schlegel writes to August in January of 1792. Fate has placed in my hands a young man from whom anything is possible. I liked him very much, and shortly after I met him, he opened wide the inner sanctum of his heart. Therein I've staked my territory and have begun research. Still a very young man, slim and of slender figure, very fine in feature, with black eyes of brilliantly expressive powers, and on fire when he speaks about some beloved topic. Indescribable how much fire. He speaks 3 times more and 3 times faster than we do, the quickest powers of comprehension and receptivity. The study of philosophy has given him a prodigal ease in the construction of fine philosophical thoughts. His point of interest is beauty, not truth. Um, so we can see that when they meet in Leipzig, Schlegel is immediately struck by the genius and the brilliance and the passion of Novalis. And we can also see that he seems to relate to him as a kind of elder or a mentor figure, even though, in fact, they're born in the same year and Novalis is slightly older than Friedrich Schlegel is. Um, okay, so then Novalis will meet Sophie von Kuhn in 1794 and fall deeply in love with this 13-year-old girl with whom he becomes engaged in 1795. Sophie von Kuhn will then die at the age of 15 in 1797, and this is a crucial event in Novalis's life, which to some degree shatters him. And his relationship with Sophie von Kuhn is a sort of source of elements of Novalis's mysticism, his profound attachment to this woman who he considers a kind of almost mystical figure. Um, at the same time, however, Novalis is a rigorous scholar. He's studying Fichte in Jena, and he begins his set of notes, which are now referred to as the Fichte Studies in 1795, which are very interesting sort of notes on Fichte's presentation of the Wissenschaftslehre in 1794. Um, then he studies engineering at a mining academy in Freiburg. He becomes a director of salt mines in Weissenfels, which is not far from Jena. And so then he'll sort of move back and forth between Jena and that position. So then he writes a number of very interesting things. He's already published a little bit of poetry, but not too much. In 1798, he'll start working on an extraordinary text, which he'll refer to as the Allgemeine Brouillon. So something like we could say universal draft or universal sketch, in which Novalis is really writing about all the topics that he knows about, moving freely between philosophy, literature, the sciences. It's referred to now as a kind of romantic encyclopedia. Um, then in 1798, he will begin publishing some crucial texts in the Athenaeum, solicited by Schlegel. So importantly, Pollen in 1798, his group of fragments in the first issue of the Athenaeum. He'll write also some texts like Faith and Love on religion, Christianity or Europe, which is on Catholicism and monarchism in 1799. And then in 1800, in I believe the final issue of the Athenaeum, he'll publish his Hymns to the Night, which is a beautiful work of poetry and prose poetry, a sort of philosophical work moving between prose and verse, which is quite an extraordinary experimental text. And then Novalis tragically will die of tuberculosis in 1801, which is also a key moment, I would say, in the breakup of the Jena Circle. But then in 1802, posthumously, Friedrich Schlegel and Ludwig Tieck will publish two of Novalis's extraordinary works of sort of experimental fiction, The Novices at Sayes and Heinrich von Ofterdingen, in which Novalis partly writes about, he writes about mines, he writes about the subterranean world that he's been involved with as an engineer and a scientist. So that's a kind of outline of their lives. And before we get into the Jena group that they're a part of, I would say that the most important thing about these two figures, particularly for me as a scholar of literature, as well as philosophy, and as someone who tries to work in an interdisciplinary way, is that both Novalis and Schlegel are, well, early figures of what we would now, in a kind of institutionally boring and perhaps ideological way, call interdisciplinarity. But these are people thinking at the crux of literature and philosophy and science and politics in a way that seems indiscernible to them. That is to say, their work doesn't only work in the interstices between different disciplines or forms of thought, but I would say fundamentally ungrounds the very basis uh, of those disciplinary foundations. So these are both, let's say, thinkers and writers in a profound sense, and in a way that we might now associate with what we call theory. That is a mode of thought that works between literature and philosophy and politics, and that isn't necessarily bound by the systematic requirements of those disciplines or genres. And I think that's the most important thing about the legacy of their work in this moment of German Romanticism.
I can nicely see how the two of them figure in with your own research and your own work and your new book that you're working on right now, which is perfect, and this is why you're here today. I think it's fantastic. Just the passion in your voice and in your face as you're speaking about these thinkers and kind of navigating us through their lives. And you did a really great job of fleshing out both the thinkers for the viewers. And I think they really got a good sense of their body of work. I really like that you also read that letter. It kind of also gave us a little more detail. So to move on, what part did Friedrich Schlegel and Novalis play in Jena Romanticism? And could you also explain what Jena Romanticism was as a philosophical and literary movement?
Sure, I can try. It's a complex topic, and famously, it's hard to say just what Jena Romanticism was, or even to some degree why it's called that. So the first thing that we might say about Jena Romanticism is that much of the activity of this group also took place in Berlin. So Friedrich Schlegel, in particular, is moving back and forth between Jena and Berlin. But Jena becomes, let's say, the center of the activities of this group, which I'll describe in more detail in a moment, who's participating, what they were up to. Jena becomes the center of that group because I think in many ways of people who are not directly part of the circle of the Jena Romantics. So that is, again, um, first and foremost, Schiller and Fichte, who have really established themselves in Jena before August Schlegel initially moves there in the mid 1790s, and then eventually Friedrich Schlegel, and then eventually Schelling. Um, Schiller and Fichte are already there. And obviously, Schiller is a figure of the utmost importance for this entire generation. And Goethe lives in Weimar, but is constantly visiting Schiller in Jena. So Goethe also has a very important presence in Jena. And then it's in 1794 that Fichte formulates and delivers the famous first version of his Wissenschaftslehre, the doctrine of science, which will have an overwhelming effect upon the thinking of Novalis, the thinking of Friedrich Schlegel, obviously the thinking of Schelling as well in this entire generation. So that's something important, I think, to get a grip on where the Jena group is coming from. That Fichte conceives of himself as regrounding and reformulating the Kantian system. Um, Grounding the Kantian system in a fundamental absolute proposition, the I equals I. And I'll talk in a minute about why I think both Novalis and Schlegel's reading and understanding of that proposition and of Fichte's work is so important for what they develop as the form of the fragment, as a new kind of writing and a new kind of thinking, which would be specifically romantic. Um, so that's in the background. Um, Schiller, Goethe, Fichte. August Schlegel and Caroline Schlegel will move to Jena in the mid 1790s. And that will be the sort of attractor for the rest of the group to eventually gather there during certain periods of the second half of the 1790s and up to 1801. So the members of the group, of course, there is no membership. This is not an official group, although because of the Athenaeum, they do certainly constitute themselves as a formation. We can just run through the names and some of the dates of when these people are in Jena, and who they are and what they're up to. So first of all, A.W. Schlegel, Friedrich's brother, classicist and translator of Shakespeare, crucially. He lives in Jena from 1796 until 1801. His wife, Caroline Böhmer Schlegel Schelling, right? Later she'll leave August Schlegel for Schelling, is a writer and critic and translator and an extremely important person. I would say in many ways the sort of heart and soul of this group. Caroline Schlegel, for example, is arrested in the early 1790s for her partisanship of the French Revolution. So we can see there that she's a figure who really demonstrates also a lot of the grounding of this group in the ideals of the French Revolution, which is crucial to them. Friedrich Schlegel moves to Jena in 1796, lives there to 1797, then lives in Berlin for a while, then comes back in 1799 to 1801. And Schlegel is involved in an affair with Dorothea Veit, who later on, when they eventually get married, will become Dorothea Schlegel. And that's a kind of scandalous affair, which Schlegel will then write a kind of slightly autobiographical version of in his novel Lucinda, which scandalizes his contemporaries. Then we have Novalis, who is a frequent visitor in Jena after 1795. Also Friedrich Schleiermacher, right? The theologian, the translator of Plato, who is the founder of what we might think of now as hermeneutics, the interpretation, the understanding of understanding. What is it to understand and interpret? Also, of course, Friedrich Schelling, the philosopher who is in Jena from 1798 to 1803 and who will eventually marry Caroline Schlegel. And Schelling is delivering lectures at the university in Jena, as you know very well. And then we have Ludwig Tieck, who is a poet and an author of what would be called, I suppose, romantic tales, sort of short stories. He's in Jena from 1799 to 801, I believe. And together, this group, the key event will be that they put together this journal, the Athenaeum. So it's published in 6 issues from 1798 to 1800. And this is an example of what Friedrich Schlegel will call sim philosophy. So philosophizing together, philosophizing as a group, such that, for example, when they publish their Athenaeum fragments, this vast group of fragments that they compose, there's no author attribution of those fragments, right? So now those fragments have been kind of, let's say, seized on by the author function. But when they were first published, one might be able to tell if one knows the writing of these different figures, but fragments by A.W. Schlegel, Friedrich Schlegel, Schleiermacher, Tieck, and Dorothea, Caroline, and Novalis are not identified by author. So we can already see here a very interesting phenomenon. These fragments move across different fields. They move freely between philosophy, criticism, art historical commentary, political commentary. And at the same time, they move between the different voices of these different authors. And all of this becomes mixed together. And so there's something very interesting about the sort of stew of the fragments where everything enters into a kind of mixture. But at the same time, the punctual determination of the fragments as sort of complete units, which are articulated or posited one by one as units of thought. And one way to think about the form of the fragment, and later on I'll read a few fragments, but I would say that my understanding of the fragment would be that the best way to think about what a fragment is as a mode of thought and writing is that a fragment is, let's say, a complete thought. So a fragment can be one sentence, or a fragment can be 2 pages, but each fragment is the development, the exposition, the positing of a thought. Um, and now we have a kind of medium of thinking where one can posit one thing and perhaps 2 pages later posit something which is almost the opposite of it, or posit one thing about philosophy, one thing about politics, one thing about, I don't know, Greek literature. And one's mind can move between these different registers. These fragments can mutually negate one another, or they can ironize one another, or they can support one another. But each one of them is a discrete unit. And each one of them doesn't necessarily belong to any field in particular, although it's hard to speak about them without speaking about the different fields that they touch upon. Um, so I would say that this form is at the core of Jena Romanticism. It really is the formal innovation by which Novalis and Friedrich Schlegel in particular invent something new that intervenes in the movement of German idealism from a very different oblique perspective. Crucially, one thing that's at issue in the fragment is the problem of the system. Schlegel will say in one of his fragments, it's equally fatal to have a system or to have none. So the problem of systematic thought is crucial for Schlegel insofar as he wants to think systematically on the one hand, but he also does not. He wants to ironize the system. And the fragments sort of constellate something like a mode of thought without it ever becoming systematic, but while still composing something like a unity. And we might think of the whole Athenaeum project as a kind of journal that attempts to do that. That is to say, it carves out a space in the intellectual history, in the Bildung of this entire generation. And it does so in a way that certainly has a very unique and determinate perspective. But at the same time, internally, that perspective, or what will be called Jena Romanticism, is incredibly heterogeneous, internally discrepant, and non-systematic. So we have something then like the organ of a non-system, a journal that lives for 2 years across 6 issues, gathers up a whole way of thinking, a whole adventure of thought, but then internally sort of disperses it amongst the positing of these fragments one by one. About their different roles in Jena Romanticism, Friedrich Schlegel and Novalis. Well, I'd say that Friedrich Schlegel is really the primary theorist of the Jena group, and he's also, let's say, the prime mover as an organizer, as an editor. He's the one getting all these contributions from different people and bringing them together and editing them. So, for example, he edits Novalis's miscellaneous observations, which are then published as pollen in the first issue of the Athenaeum. And I think that he also really he suggests to Novalis that Novalis write fragments. Um, Novalis, on the other hand, I would say is a kind of inspiration, as we can see from that letter from Friedrich for this group. And he's also an instigation to think across all of these different fields and to inhabit none of them. Novalis kind of flits in and out of this group, in some ways is marginal to it, but in other ways is kind of the heart and soul of the group, insofar as he constitutes something like a kind of subjective principle or a kind of spirit of of a poetic form of thought that can be both philosophical and scientific and also literary. And so they play very different roles in that respect, but I would say that in their different ways, Novalis and Schlegel are equally central to the group.
I actually didn't know what a fragment was. I mean, I've read fragments, but I didn't, but you gave such a nice definition of what a fragment is in relation to their work. Um, do you think it's fair to say that the Jena Romantic Circle or the Jena Circle kind of dispersed after the death of Novalis? How did they deal with this death of their comrade?
Well, I think they probably would have dispersed anyway, and I'm not sure that that the death of Novalis was really the central event in the breakup of this group. Probably more important are some of the tensions around the relationships between August Schlegel and Caroline Schlegel and Schelling. Also, some of the tensions between this group and Schiller, where Schiller obviously is a mentor and almost a kind of god for these figures, along with Goethe. But, Friedrich Schlegel in particular, I think, was kind of a difficult person, and he was a kind of avant-gardist, right, who could not, in some ways, tolerate having that kind of mentor. So the sort of friction that developed between Friedrich Schlegel and Schiller also, I think, was an element in him moving away from Jena. So there are many different factors there, but certainly the death of Novalis from tuberculosis in 1801 is a traumatic thing, in particular for Friedrich Schlegel. It's also interesting that um, Novalis, when he writes Christianity or Europe in 1799, which is just a fascinating text, it's a text that grows out of his studies of the Middle Ages. And in that text, he's really idealizing Catholicism as a force that brings together Europe around a unity and around the figure of the Pope as one symbolic figure who kind of unifies the whole of Europe across linguistic and proto-national boundaries. And no, for Novalis, that's very important in the midst of what we might think of as the kind of separations of modernity. Um, but at the same time, although that monarchism or Catholicism might be thought of as kind of conservative, in Novalis, it isn't quite like that because Novalis is so interesting, that everything that he touches, even if it's an argument for like monarchist Catholicism, sort of turns into something strange, and unfamiliar. But perhaps the death of Novalis and that sort of movement of Novalis's thought, I think sometimes might have something to do with Schlegel then falling into a kind of more conservative form of political thinking and religious attachment later in the first decade of the 1800s.
Well, now you have me all excited. So, are there particular passages in the work of Schlegel and Novalis that might illuminate the style of their thinker for our listeners and viewers? And could you share one or two passages and perhaps offer an interpretation of them?
Sure. Well, I'll focus on two longer passages in a moment, but first let me just read a few very brief Novalis fragments from Pollen that might give you a taste of his philosophical sensibility. So the very first fragment in Pollen in English is, "We seek everywhere we seek the unconditioned, and always find only things," right? Where unconditioned is unbedingte and things is Dinge, right? So everywhere we seek the unbedingte, the unconditioned, and we always find only things, Dinge. So we're confronted with empirical particulars, but we yearn for and we seek the unconditioned, the absolute. Secondly, and relatedly, an amazing a fragment by Novalis. "We will never entirely comprehend ourselves, but we can and will do much more than comprehend ourselves." So there we have a nice fragment expressive of the kind of ungrounding of the understanding that Novalis recognizes and affirms, right? We will never entirely understand ourselves or comprehend ourselves. In Fichtean terms, we will never be entirely identical to ourselves. Um, but on the other hand, we will do much more than comprehend ourselves. So there we have something like the romantic vocation, right? Understanding, it's not unimportant, but we will go beyond what can be understood. And then along those lines, and with that sense of vocation in mind, uh, another fragment, "We are on a mission. Our vocation is the cultivation of the earth. Bildung, das Erde," right? So the Bildung of the earth is a very ambiguous fragment, but one thing I would say about it is that Novalis, in some ways, in a way that maybe anticipates certain elements in Hegel's philosophy of nature, he views human spirit as something which grows out of the earth and which is involved with the entire earth and the entire cosmos in some sense. And then it turns back upon that genesis to cultivate it, right? Our vocation is the cultivation of the earth. So we see the huge ambition of this group and this generation, which now, if we look back upon from the perspective of late modernity, might seem to have been shattered. But we see this moment amid the French Revolution in the wake of Kantian philosophy, the sort of explosive vocation of Romantic thinking. So in terms of Romantic thinking, let me focus on a passage in Novalis that gives us a kind of definition of Romanticism. He says, "The world must be romanticized. In this way, one rediscovers its original meaning. To romanticize is nothing other than qualitative potentiation. In this operation, the lower self will become identical with the better self. Just as we ourselves are such a quantitative series of potencies, this operation is still entirely unknown. When I give the commonplace a higher meaning, the ordinary a mysterious aspect, the known the dignity of the unknown, I romanticize it. The operation for the higher, the unknown, the mystical, infinite is the converse. This becomes logarithmic through this connection. It assumes a familiar expression. And then he simply says, romantic philosophy, lingua romana, reciprocal raising and lowering. So to romanticize for Novalis, I would emphasize a couple things about this characterization. First, it's an operation which is described in mathematical terms. It's described as an operation of an exponent, right? It's a logarithmic operation, right? So if we have 2 to the power of 3, right, the result is 8, right? So when we operate upon the number 2, the base, with the exponential function 3, we raise it, right, by the power of 3 to the number 8. And then we can also, if we understand that logarithmic function, we can reduce or we can lower the number 8 to the number 2. We can return to the base. This is how Novalis conceives of um, giving the lower a higher meaning, or giving the ordinary a mysterious aspect, or giving the known the dignity of the unknown. And on the other hand, giving the mystical or the infinite a familiarity by lowering it. So reciprocal raising and lowering. And I think that this, I use this passage because it's so representative of the way in which Novalis is a kind of poetic mathematician and a mathematical poet, um, thinking about the mystical in the everyday and the everyday and the mystical as a mathematical operation. Let me read a couple passages from Schlegel. So also, I would say that translation is from this wonderful new translation of Novalis by James D. Reed, which is just an incredible contribution that was just published last year by Oxford. Um, and then in Schlegel, that's from the Athenaeum fragments. So here's one brief passage from a longer fragment, but I think it's an incredible commentary on um, Schlegel's philosophical acuity. So he says something as simple as an idea is a concept perfected to the point of irony. And then he'll say an absolute synthesis of absolute antitheses, the continual self-creating interchange of two conflicting thoughts. So let's return to that initial formulation. An idea is a concept perfected to the point of irony. What does that mean, right? It has this kind of gnomic character of the fragment. It's mysterious, it's pithy, it's a kind of riddling formulation. However, it has, I think, in Kantian terms, an extremely determinate and rigorous sense. So an idea is a concept perfected to the point of irony. So how does Kant generate the ideas? Let's take the ideas soul, world, and God. Right? So we remember in the Kantian system, those ideas of reason are generated from concepts of the understanding, right? They're generated from the concept of substance or identity, generates the idea of soul, the unity of the soul. The idea of causality generates the idea of world as the totality of all causes. And the idea of community um, generates the idea of God as the being of all beings. And so ideas are generated by concepts, but why is an idea a concept perfected to the point of irony? Well, partly because, as Kant shows, we can think the ideas as totalities, right? But we can never know them, right? So they're generated from the understanding, but they go beyond the understanding into the domain of reason in such a way that we have to think them. As Kant will say, it's the fate of reason that we have to think the ideas, and yet we can never know them. And moreover, when we do think them, Kant will show that the ideas of reason generate antinomies of reflection, right? We can make equally strong arguments for either side of the case for did the universe, has it always existed, or does it have a beginning at one point in time? That's what Schlegel means when he says an absolute synthesis of absolute antitheses, right? A continual self-creating interchange of two conflicting thoughts. So even in this pointed little one sentence articulation, um, Schlegel gives us a kind of concept of irony which is gleaned from Kant's critical philosophy. An idea is a concept perfected to the point of irony. And then we can see how irony, for Schlegel, is something which has a philosophical genesis that belongs to his own time, right? Irony is the fate of reason. I think this is a very important passage in Schlegel because famously, Hegel will go on to viciously criticize the concept of romantic irony articulated by Schlegel in his introduction to his lectures on aesthetics. And of course, is an amazing passage where Hegel talks about Schlegel's theory of irony for several pages. And it's in many ways, a wonderful exposition of what is meant by romantic irony. At the same time, Hegel has, I think, a very reductive view of how philosophically rigorous Schlegel's understanding of irony actually is. And I just want to say one more thing about that before we move on, which is that as Hegel certainly recognizes, Schlegel's understanding of irony is drawn from Fichte's absolute proposition, the I equals I. But if we just pause for a moment and analyze the genesis of that proposition, right, it begins from the necessity of affirming the fact that A equals A as a kind of logical necessity. It has to be said that if there is an A, then there is A. Um, and the I, then the formula I equals I, is implicitly generated from that affirmation and a reflection upon that affirmation. That is to say, if I say that if there is A, then there is an I that affirms that and that also posits itself in that logical operation. And insofar as it moves across the copula, the A is A, that I has to remain identical to itself. So we find that in positing A is A, we also, and at the same time, posit I is I. There's a kind of exposition of Kant's unity of transcendental apperception, transcendental unity of apperception. And Novalis will then argue at the beginning of his Fichte studies, right? He'll say something very interesting right away. He'll say, the essence of identity can only be presented in an illusory proposition, Scheinsatz. He says that we abandon the identical in order to present it. So Novalis already thinks about the way in which the A has to double itself to affirm its identity, in which it has to double itself into an I that then doubles itself to affirm its own identity across the copula. And Schlegel is thinking about the non-identity produced by this relationship between the positing and the posited as an act. The relation between the act and the fact that Fichte expresses in his term Tathandlung. And he's thinking about the irony of these logical operations. And he's, I think, also relating them to the transcendental dialectic in Kant. So behind some of Schlegel's very flippant formulations, one can find a great deal of philosophical rigor.
You're doing a really wonderful job of not only navigating us through these thinkers, but in a very subtle rich and kind of robust way, showing us the kind of interconnection, the nexus, the layered continuity of
Mm.
interdisciplinarity from moving from fragments to Kant, to showing, the very interesting way that irony is being used to relate to other things from Schlegel and Novalis, and this is just wonderful. Um, do you think you could tell us about the historical context in which Schlegel and Novalis were writing? And how do you think their work is related and intervened in that context?
Problem. I mean, the key thing to think about here, of course, is the French Revolution. But in doing so, I mean, it's also important to think about the French Revolution as, let's say, kind of synecdoche for the entire experience of modernity. That is to say, a part for a whole. Um, One might think of the French Revolution as a kind of fragment of modernity. Um, and indeed, Schlegel will say that he thinks about the French Revolution as a kind of allegory of um, Kant's critical philosophy. I suppose I'm not entirely sure what he means by that. One would have to construct one's own theory and approach to that, but we see how the problem of freedom um, generated by the Kantian system, dovetails with and blends in with the events of the French Revolution in a way which is obviously absolutely crucial to this whole generation of thinkers, running up to, let's say, the publication of the Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807. Um, Schlegel famously says that the French Revolution, Fichte's philosophy, and Goethe's Meister are the three foremost tendencies of the age. So a political revolution, a philosophical system, and a Bildungsroman, right? Which is about the sort of self-formation of the individual and the artist. And a novel which reflects upon itself as a novel of formation. So a novel that is its own Bildung, we might say, even as it represents a process of Bildung. So those three things for Schlegel are intimately related. Um, the French Revolution, uh, Fichte and Goethe. But think about this generation of people living through the 1790s. Um, in the background is Kant. And then it seems like the sort of political implications of Kant are, exploded by this process of the French Revolution. And its ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that sort of sweep across Europe and that gather up enthusiastic partisans like Carolyn Boomer, who becomes Carolyn Schlegel in the early 1790s, who will be again arrested for her partisanship of the revolution, for her political views. That's the kind of thing that Kant means in the contest of faculties when he says that the spontaneous enthusiasm of the people of Europe for the ideals of the French Revolution, which is not in their own interests, displays the tendency toward good in humanity as a species. I have some qualms about that judgment, but one can see what he means, right? There's something in the way that people respond to the ideals of the French Revolution, which indicates a kind of an infinite desire for freedom and equality, that people adhere to regardless of their self-interest. Um, and I think that we can situate the Jena group, stemming in many ways from Caroline Schlegel, bringing them together and holding them together in this kind of extended salon of the Jena period, as stemming from that kind of enthusiasm that Fichte also embodies. That is to say, there's a new mode of political organization which is possible. There's a new form of thought which is possible in Europe, and it's in, on the one hand, France, and on the other hand, in Germany, represented by Jena. And these two things have to be brought together and crystallized in a process of Bildung, right? Like that represented in Goethe's Meister. And this is their project. And the concept of the project is very important to Schlegel. He'll say a project is the subjective embryo of a developing object. And we might think of the French Revolution then over to the side of them in the background, but as something like a political project, which is the embryo of a developing object, that is, of a future state of affairs that they are attempting to bring into being. And for the Jena group, that requires not only the affirmation of certain political principles, but it also requires new forms of thought, new ways of combining the faculties, new ways of thinking between philosophy and literature and the sciences that they're attempting to formulate, new modes of freedom that extend not only to civic affairs or the ethics of individuals and their personal relationships, but also to the very ground of our modes of thought. And the fragment form then is a kind of stirring up of that ground and a thinking in the interstices of the freedom of the faculties, let's put it that way. At the same time, they're in a very contradictory relationship to the French Revolution because, of course, they're partisans of the French Revolution in Germany. So this is part, I think, of the irony and the paradoxical quality of political activity and political thinking in the 1790s, if you're a German, that on the one hand, you're attempting to create a new generation of German thought and literature. On the other hand, you're doing so from a perspective which is fundamentally in sympathy with the French. Um, and this is obviously a very tricky tightrope to walk.
Well, that was an absolutely excellent answer, and you've been doing such a wonderful job of really filling in all of these concepts in both the passages that you've been reading and also the just the historical context and how everything has kind of overlapped uh, and related. And I'm very excited that we've been doing this discussion, and it's been flying by actually. But last question,
Mhm.
and I'm excited about this question actually. You're currently writing a book about the poetics of the legacy of Jena Romanticism. Could you say a bit about that project?
Sure, it's a complicated and at this point a long developing project. So the title of the project now, for reasons that may have become apparent, is The Irony of Ground: Studies in the Poetics of Romantic Modernity. Um, I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but the project began under the title Expanded Poetics, Romantic Modernist Contemporary, um, where at the beginning I conceived of this as a kind of a study of the prehistory of what now, again, I would say in an institutional and kind of ideological way we call interdisciplinarity. So if famously in fragment 116 of the Jena fragments, Schlegel will define romantic poetry, romantische Poesie, as something that includes the sciences and all the arts and the ethical conduct of everyday life, etc. Basically, he's saying romantic poetry is the kind of poetry which is everything. And so this poses, of course, a very difficult categorical problem. It's like, okay, well, if romantic poetry includes all the sciences and the arts and political life, then what specificity does poetry have as a literary practice, or why use the term poetry at all? And what's I think at stake in that problem is the relationship between poetry as a practice of literary writing on the one hand, and on the other hand, poesis as production or formation or as making. Um, so Schlegel is after, let's say, the poesis in poetry, and it's poesis that he wants to say is involved, right, in all the arts, in the sciences, in political life. That is to say, there's a kind of generative principle and a generative force, a force of production and of making, which ought to be accessed within any form of human activity. And romantische Poesie is a way of thinking about poetry that involves it in that sort of heterogeneous and totalizing in a way activity. But he'll also say that what's constitutive of romantic poetry is that it's always in a state of becoming, right? So it's never finished. It's an infinite process. So what I'm trying to do in the book is think about how that idea of romantische Poesie, of romantic poetry, might be a way of approaching relationships between the arts or relationships between um, poetry and politics throughout the course of modernity. So that Romanticism is not just a discrete period in the 1790s or the early 18th century, or maybe the early to late 19th century, sorry, but rather is something like a principle of ungrounding um, that persists throughout artistic activity and that persists beneath the surface of distinctions between disciplines throughout modernity, but undergoes transformations across the periods that we know as, let's say, um, the Romantic, the Modernist, and the Contemporary. So the way that I do that then is I try to trace, of course, I can't, work across everything that has happened over the past 230 years. So what I try to do is write chapters as case studies. So just to give you some examples, the first chapter is which I've given as a talk but haven't published yet, is a chapter on references to Beethoven's Third Symphony in the late work of the artist Jean-Michel Basquiat. So in the late 80s, Basquiat starts writing Eroica, Eroica, Eroica all over a number of his canvases, which is the title of Beethoven's Third Symphony, which is famously his revolutionary symphony. And so I try to reconstruct, what's at stake in the relationship between Basquiat and Beethoven, and through that, what's at stake in the relationship between painting and the Romantic Symphony, but also then what's at stake in the relationship between the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. Basquiat's father is Haitian. Throughout his corpus, there are many references to the Haitian Revolution, which is going on at the same time, obviously, as the French Revolution, and is in a way part of it, and which kind of ironizes the ideals of the French Revolution in a way that Beethoven, I think, knew nothing about. So I use this relationship between Basquiat and Beethoven, painting and music, to kind of also think through that relationship between the French and Haitian revolutions. Then more quickly, I also have chapters uh, on the contemporary architect Peter Zumthor and the poet Friedrich Hölderlin, on the sort of poetics of the elements that are at issue in Zumthor's architecture and Hölderlin's poetry. Um, I have a chapter on the artist Joan Mitchell, and her relationship to she's an abstract expressionist painter. Her relationship to French poetry and the question of Genesis as it unfolds between, let's say, color on the one hand and poetic writing on the other hand. I have a chapter on the poetry of Aimé Césaire and Césaire's implicit claim that free verse has its genesis in the beginnings of the Haitian Revolution. Actually, in a Vodou ritual that inaugurated the Haitian Revolution in the summer of 1791. So that's a chapter where I try to think through the relationship between politics and poetry. And at this point, this used to be a 5-chapter book project, but now I think it's ballooned into something like a 10-chapter book project that I'll probably be working on for a number of years yet. So don't expect it too soon. But it's been a fun thing that allows me to ground my thinking in the Jena Romantics, but also then pursue a lot of the different things I'm interested in music and architecture and painting and literature, and move across different periods of modernity.
No, it sounds like a fantastic project. And when you're finished, I hope you will return and discuss the book with me. I also do a book series, and
Hmm.
I'd love to also help support the work. And of course, the scholar that is, or yourself, that is, has written and long, 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 tedious amounts of research on this. I really, really like this idea of using Basquiat because Basquiat is also not the traditional painter, right? He had there's a kind of political affinity in his art, right? And there's also he kind of moves away from the traditional painting style. Like I think he starts painting on he starts using modes of graffiti in a sense, right? In his really kind of earlier work. And I really like that, how you're really bringing in this kind of mode of interdisciplinarity. It's very, very nice. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. I mean, I guess I would just make one last comment. I guess we're at the end of our time here, but Basquiat is also interesting because he's so interested in irony. He has
Mhm.
many paintings where he uses the term, and I think he's constantly thinking through and working within the sort of medium of irony. And so that's the last thing I wanted to say about this group, and also this project that I'm working on, which is titled "The Irony of Ground." What I think is so important about Schlegel and Novalis's operation upon Fichte is that they unground the grounding of the eye. They unground the absolute proposition. That's what they're interested in. But at the same time, they know that um, one cannot either have a ground or entirely have no ground, just like one cannot entirely have a system or have no system. So I think that the theory of irony is what I call the irony of ground is neither an operation of ungrounding nor of grounding, but rather thinking about the very fact that every time that one posits a ground, one implicitly ungrounds it through the very act of positing. And on the other hand, every act of ungrounding also posits something like a new ground. That is to say, a new beginning or a new inception. And the form of the fragment, I think, for these two thinkers is precisely that form of thought and writing, which always allows you again and again, each time, to posit something new, to rethink what was thought before, but nevertheless, not just to dissolve it into indetermination, each time to posit a new determination of thought, which is called the fragment. And I think that's the kind of fundamental contribution that they make at the crux of literature and philosophy.
Well, the viewers are in for an absolutely amazing episode. You've been such a wonderful guest, and you've done such a brilliant job of going through all of these themes. And I have to say that I actually learned a lot about both Novalis and Schlegel. I knew very little about Schlegel, which is unfortunate, and my knowledge of Novalis has increased greatly from this interview and from this episode. And I want to thank you for participating in the series, and you've been such a wonderful addition to this ongoing project of kind of archiving all of these thinkers.
Well, thanks so much. Again, I really appreciate the invitation and you're doing great work. Keep it up. Thanks,
Thank you
Chris.
very much.
Okay.
Have a good
Bye.
one.